A friend of mine just recently took his family to Zion National Park in Utah, and he showed us pictures of him and his sons going up Angel's Landing, which is a place there. Raise your hand if you've ever been on Angel's Landing in Utah. One? Yes, good. You're braver than I am. About 20 years ago, I went with my brothers, and you can get pretty much to the top with a pretty safe trail, and it's a big flat area. And now they have railings. I don't know if they did 20 years ago, but they have railings. I'm pretty comfortable there. It falls off on both sides, and you can just see for miles. It's beautiful. But that's not Angel's Landing. That's where you get to start the next half mile, not very long, but it's like a shark fin. You go straight up the side of this shark fin to this point. That's Angel's Landing. And they have posts with chains. You're supposed to hold on to the chain as you go. What I tell people is where it's still flat before you even get there, my heart's beating, my hands are sweating. I'm already seeing the headlines in the papers about falling off and my orphan children and all of that. And I'm laying there shaking in the fetal position with little kids going, "Excuse me, mister," and hopping across me. My friend said, "Just don't look down." And I said, okay, I got really good, worst case scenario vision. So yeah, there's no not just looking down. But to his point, it does matter where you look. It does matter what you're focused on. For him, he was able to focus on the trail and get up there, and his sons went with him. It does matter where you look. This bully in high school, just looking away solved the problem. Later in life, as an adult, I had a coworker, which is, she wasn't exactly a bully, but every time I talked to her, I felt worse. And she would go by my office, and I'd look up, make eye contact, and if I made eye contact, she'd stop and talk, and if she stopped and talked, I felt worse about myself. And then I suddenly realized, it matters where I look. Why don't I just not look up? And so from then on, she would go by and she'd kind of pause at my door, and then she'd go on, and I felt good about myself. It does matter where you look. When they're teaching people how to drive, they tell them, don't look at the traffic coming towards you. Look at the road where you're trying to go. And so when we're driving, it does matter where we look. A different job I had, there was a lady named Georgia, and she knew everything. This was in a manufacturing plant. And somehow, she didn't really like, I was a young college kid coming into the manufacturing plant. She didn't really, she liked being the boss, and she wasn't my boss. But again, every interaction with Georgia led to a little bit of a conflict, a little bit of not feeling as good about myself. But at that time, I went to a church, South Highland Presbyterian Church, got invited to a Bible study with some young men, and began getting deep in the Word. And it was my first time, honestly, doing that kind of Bible study. I might not have been to Sunday school class all my life, but never a Bible study with men where we were digging so deeply. What I found out is that in that manufacturing plant, Georgia did not change her behavior a bit, but all of a sudden it didn't matter. It didn't bother me because all of a sudden I was focused on Jesus Christ. I was looking at Jesus and seeing her through that lens. And frankly, you begin to feel sorry for people like that when you look at them through the lens of faith in Jesus Christ. As long as I was looking directly at her and my feelings were controlled by her, I didn't feel good. But when I started focusing on Jesus Christ, I was able to walk through and go to work every day, and it just didn't matter anymore. Now, I know some problems are a lot harder than that. I fully realize that. But a lot of times, it does matter where you look and what you're looking at. When I was in Austin, we went to a little church, in seminary in Austin. We went to a little church, and I always remember this man walking up the aisle. He did not have a walker. He had two canes. I guess he didn't want a walker. He had two canes. And he came up to me and he introduced himself and found out we were at seminary. And he said one thing. He said, as you go through school, keep your eyes on Jesus. Keep your eyes on Jesus. He knew with all the education and all the studying that it's easy to get distracted and go down rabbit holes and forget why you came. So he said, keep your eye on Jesus. This is what Peter experienced. When Peter stepped out of the boat, he was totally focused on Jesus. He had just seen Jesus feed 5,000 people. He had been traveling with him. He'd heard the teaching. He'd seen the miracles. And so he took a chance and he said, okay, tell me to come to you. And he stepped out of the boat. And miraculously, he was walking on water. We all know Jesus walked on water, but Peter did too. He had faith. He was looking in the right place. He was looking at Jesus. But then, like we all do in storms, he looked away. He started paying attention to what was wrong, not what was right. He started paying attention to the storm and the wind and the waves, and he sank. Oftentimes, I think we do the same thing. Oftentimes, I know I do the same things. I get distracted by what's going wrong, and I start to focus on that, and it builds in my head, and it builds, and I begin to sink emotionally, spiritually, sometimes physically. Thankfully, most of the time, there's something that reminds me to look up at Jesus. It may come in a prayer. It may come in the middle of a worship service when I'm like, oh yeah, that's my job. And remember to focus on Jesus. But in those moments, I find that I'm strengthened again. I find that the storm's not as bad as I thought it was. It doesn't necessarily even go away. It's like the woman in the manufacturing plant, Georgia. She never went away. She never changed. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter anymore because I saw it through a bigger picture, bigger lens. And that is what the disciples experienced in this boat. They saw him feed the 5,000. Now they see him walking on water. And they say, truly, this is the Son of God. And they were blessed by that knowledge. And when we, at our best, are able to look past all the storms, look to Jesus Christ, the storms don't always go away. In this story, the wind went away. Everything calmed down. In our life, the storms don't always go away, but we can usually walk through them a little bit easier. We can usually walk through them a little bit stronger. And when we, as people in the congregation, when we as Christians see others walking through the storm, we ought to walk with them. We ought to help them look up. We ought to remind them that they're loved. We ought to remind them that they are in the hands of Jesus Christ, even in the midst of this storm. So my invitation to you is to remember that it matters where you look. And this week, as you're facing the normal ups and downs of the world we live in, ask yourself what you're looking at. Are you looking at the storm, the wind, the waves? Or are you looking at Jesus? Are you able to see the storm through that lens? That's my invitation for you to this week, is to remember it matters where you look and make your best effort to look at Jesus Christ, who reaches out to each one of us in the midst of the storm. Amen.